Minister of Justice, after that moment of euphoria, that moment of panic sets in, and I called PMO back and said, I get to keep Arif Irani, right, as Parliamentary Secretary? And they said yes. He is an outstanding member of Parliament. He is passionate, he is intelligent, il parle très bien français, et donc c'est un autre atout qu'il a. He is passionate about access to justice and legal aid, and he has worked very hard on this file. Perhaps it's the fact that he came as a refugee from Uganda, or perhaps his experience founding Salco, the legal clinic here in Toronto, one of the co-founders. I don't know, but he's passionate, he's outstanding, and it's a pleasure to turn the microphone over to Arif.
Thank you, David. That's quite flattering, quite humbling. We're also big soccer fans, so we enjoy watching some footy together as well. So I wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here. It's been an honor to be your member of Parliament and to serve you. And I wanted to say welcome to this riding. I wanted to say thank you to Parkdale Intercultural Association, to Michael and Sering and the whole team, and Rita Cox, who's here with us, the founder, for welcoming us here and for hosting us here, the Legal Clinic and PIA. I think what you find in these two organizations, PCLS and PIA, is just an example of some of the incredible work that gets done in Parkdale by countless settlement agencies. I'm looking out at many of the people that run these groups. And what these groups do is they work to defend, they work to settle, and to integrate newcomers, which is something that I believe strongly in. You heard David mention that I came here as a newcomer, as a refugee myself from Uganda. I became a human rights and constitutional lawyer, and en route I actually worked at 3 different legal clinics. I now serve as your member of Parliament. And what I'll tell you is that it's not very often in my thus far 4-year parliamentary career that all of those worlds collide with one issue. And that issue was the cuts to legal aid that manifested a few months ago. And those cuts were issues that actually, to be frank, appalled me because I found them to be indefensible. Indefensible from an economic perspective, indefensible from an evidence-based perspective, and indefensible from an ethical perspective. I think when you're talking about the issue of determining someone's ability to seek safe haven in this country simply on their ability to pay for legal counsel, you've got a problem, an ethical, serious ethical problem. So when you're faced with injustice, you start to advocate. And that's what I did. I am an advocate, and I started to advocate. And you take meetings and calls from people who are in this room, and you meet with people, stakeholders from this riding, stakeholders from around the city, from around the country, and you hear their sense of outrage, and you communicate that sense of outrage, and you take that call to Ottawa. But you can take lots of things to Ottawa, and things can be all for naught unless you have a team and a leader that is willing to listen. And I'm very proud to be part of such a team. And that team includes people like Minister Lametti, who is not doing himself justice because he is trying to offer up what I've done to advocate on this file. But it started with him and his team pushing this issue. It's people like Minister Morneau recognizing the importance of this issue. And then it's the leader. And by that, I mean the fine gentleman behind me, the Prime Minister. And what I can tell you about the Prime Minister is 2 things that I've been struck with over the past 4 years. One is his genuine desire to hear from his caucus, because it's through his caucus he links to the various communities around this country, and he understands what communities want and what communities are concerned about. And I also have come to appreciate his ability and desire to act when leadership is required to protect the most vulnerable in Canada. And I'll pick up on a theme that Minister Lametti mentioned. I've seen it time and time again in terms of our commitment to access to justice. So I'll remind you about restoring the Court Challenges Program, a program where you get government funding to bring a charter claim to challenge discrimination or inequality. I'll remind you of the decision of this government to implement massive reforms to the family justice system to ensure that women, specifically women, don't get clogged up spending money in court and instead can access the support for spousal support and child support that they so richly deserve. And I'll mention to you and remind you again of most recently the decision to rescue the Pro Bono Law Ontario program in this province to ensure low-income Canadians in Ontario have access to legal counsel. So that brings us to today, a day in which I'm delighted to welcome the Prime Minister back to Parkdale High Park to speak to you about the next step our government is taking to protect the most marginalized and to promote access to justice in Canada. So without further ado, it is my distinct honor to welcome the Right Honourable Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau.
Thank you all for being here today. Merci d'être ici. C'est un grand plaisir d'être de retour dans la région de Toronto, surtout pour une annonce si importante. A great pleasure to see Arif and the entire team here. Arif and I have known each other for more than 25 years now, and his values, his passion, his strength, his advocacy for the most vulnerable have shone through in everything he does with the insightful approach he brings to everything. So it's a real pleasure to be here in Parkdale High Park with you. It's a pleasure to be here today, but I'm not overly happy about the announcement we've had to make, we're about to make. The reality is we shouldn't be having to make this announcement. I think far too many people in this room and indeed around the country are trying to forget as much as they can about the Harper years when we had a government that cut services for the most vulnerable any chance it could. The worst example of that was definitely when they chose to cut health care for refugees. The most vulnerable people we could imagine in our country being brushed aside by a government that was more focused on pinching pennies and balancing the books than actually helping the most vulnerable. So the fact that we have to be here today to recognize that yet another Conservative government, the government of Doug Ford, is walking away from services to the most vulnerable is really frustrating for me, and I think for all Canadians, that we keep moving back, or there's Conservative politicians that keep trying to move us back and make the most vulnerable hurt for decisions that they make. And Conservative politicians like to say they're for the people, but then they end up cutting services for the most vulnerable. It's what they do. The responsibility over legal aid on immigration and refugees has long been a joint responsibility, a shared responsibility by the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario. And for many years, the Government of Ontario was a strong and proud partner in making sure that our most vulnerable refugees had the basic services they need, particularly in terms of legal aid when they arrive in a situation that is fraught with challenges and indeed vulnerabilities. But the Ford government decided to step away from that. And that's why, in this area of shared responsibility, the federal government is choosing to step up. We will be investing $26.8 million this year to ensure that legal aid services for immigrants and refugees continue in the province of Ontario. We will also be topping up investments in other provinces to reach the 100% funding mark for legal aid to immigrants and refugees. But we will engage in reflections and conversations in the coming year about how to ensure long-term sustainability for legal aid for refugees and immigrants. And we will work very hard, like I know many Ontarians will, to make sure that this Ontario government understands that you cannot continue to harm vulnerable people and pretend that you are actually for the people. So that is what we are going to stay focused on. Nous allons toujours être là pour défendre les vulnérables dans ce pays. Parce que c'est la chose morale et responsable à faire en tant que pays, en tant que gens généreux et ouverts et pleins de compassion dans ce pays. Mais c'est aussi une partie de notre promesse envers le monde et envers les générations futures. We know that taking care of people who want nothing more than to build strong lives for themselves and their children, fleeing hardship from around the world, fleeing war, strife, persecution, torture, have so much to contribute to this country and are just looking for the opportunity to do that. That's why we are going to ensure that they have the support to make it through our immigration system in a way that gives them all the chances of being able to build that better future for their kids. C'est quelque chose que nous faisons en tant que pays parce que c'est la bonne chose à faire. We do this as a country because it's the right thing to do, and as a federal government, we will be there to support the most vulnerable from coast to coast to coast. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Je vais juste ajouter quelques petits mots en français parce que M. Lemaitre a souligné que je suis tout à fait bilingue. Donc, tout est au début, je m'excuse, mais il faut aussi souligner qu'on est sur les terres des peuples autochtones. So we are on Indigenous territory here in Parkdale, like in many other parts of Toronto. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. I would also like to just acknowledge, before introducing the next speaker, some of my many colleagues who are very much supporters and defenders of this very issue. So on my right, on your left, on the far side is Gary Nandasangri, the member for Scarborough Rouge Park, and Adam Vaughan to Mr. Minister Lametti's immediate right, the member for Spadina Fort York. We have Marco Mendocino in the middle on the left here, the member for Eglinton Lawrence. Julie Zerowitz, the member for Davenport, and James Maloney, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore. Yes, please. I'd just like to next call upon an individual whom I know personally, but whom I know through many of the circles through which many of us travel. This is a woman named Shalini Konanur, who is currently the executive director and one of the lawyers on staff at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. The South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario is something that's very near and dear to my heart because I was one of a group of individuals who thought creating a SALCO was a good idea after we learned from people like Avi Go about the hard work that she was doing at the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, people like Margaret Parsons at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. There was a void. The clinic filled that void, but it's the staff that have made that clinic come to fruition. What Shalini does on a daily basis is deal with the issues of which we are speaking about now. She deals with refugees, she deals with newcomers, she deals with things like forced marriages, she deals with gender inequality on the ground. And Shalini is here to share some of that wisdom, which she has shared many times with us at various standing committees in Ottawa and in test case litigation all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, but to share some of those insights about the impact of decisions like this today and what it means for her clientele. Welcome, Shalini.
Deep breath. Thank you, Ara. Thank you to the Prime Minister and Minister Lametti. I'm grinning from ear to ear. This morning I was very happy, and my partner and children said, "You're unusually happy when you're usually very cranky." And I said, "You'll know why soon, right?" And thank you for saying I've shared my wisdom, which actually means I've yelled at almost every person who's standing behind me right now. Really and truly, what I believe, and I think what so many people in this room believe, is that access to justice is the single right that makes every other right possible. If you cannot have access to justice, it is virtually impossible for the vulnerable communities that we work with to assert their legal rights. It's been a challenging time with the loss of legal aid service, definitely in Ontario, and in particular the significant loss of service in immigration and refugee law. And the truth is, I don't think providing service like this is a partisan issue. To be honest, I think that as Canadians and Ontarians, we all believe that protecting and serving our most vulnerable clients is critical to the foundation of our communities and our society. Hearing this announcement made me think and reflect on some of the clients I've met in the past couple of weeks. Just yesterday, I met with a woman who was finally brave enough to call the police on her abusive partner, who immediately called immigration and pulled her sponsorship application. I think about the fact that legal aid is now going to be supported to be able to provide her with service and that she possibly can stay here. I think about the client that I had a few weeks ago who's facing an LGBTQ claim, a refugee claim for being persecuted in his home country. And I think about that day scratching my head thinking, how am I going to give this person advice on how to do this in court by himself? I think about the client I met last week who is doing a gender-based violence claim and speaks almost no English, and me giving her the insane advice of watching a video on the Immigration and Refugee Board on how to handle her own case. And it just makes me so happy To think now with this announcement, which is so welcome, that these types of clients are going to again be supported. There's a critical need in Ontario for this kind of support. And it doesn't just affect the legal system. It doesn't just affect legal clinics. The ripple effect is that our sister agencies, settlement agencies, and my colleagues in the room from settlement agencies know this, is that when they can't come to us, they come to them. Parkdale Intercultural, the members of Advocacy, the members of CultureLink, they are all being flooded with requests for how do they get that help. I just want to finish by saying thank you so much. This is such a welcome announcement. I think access to justice is such a critical piece of our justice system, and this announcement will really put us on the path forward to ensuring those clients, particularly immigrants and refugees in Ontario, will get the much needed support that they need. Thank you.
So that concludes the formal portion of the announcement. The Prime Minister will be available to take some questions from the media at this point. Prime Minister?
Hi, Prime Minister. It's Paola Larigio with the Canadian Press. If you could answer all questions today in French and English, I think my colleagues would really appreciate it. You spoke today, you spoke out against provincial governments making cuts to services. This isn't the first time that you've stepped in with some money to make up for some of those cuts. Are you not essentially setting up a system that enables provincial governments to make whatever controversial cuts to services they want because they know your government will pony up some funds?
No, that is something that we are all very concerned about. The fact that Conservative governments continue to make cuts is something that we all have to reflect on as citizens and as voters about what Conservative governments have repeatedly done and have repeatedly say they were going to do. This is a specific area of shared responsibility between the federal government and the government of Ontario, and the fact that the government of Ontario is pulling back from its support of the most vulnerable means that we are stepping in with a one-year top-up to make sure that services continue for the most vulnerable. There will be discussions ongoing about que malheureusement, il y a bien des domaines dans lesquels les gouvernements conservateurs sont en train de couper pour les plus vulnérables. Ceci est une annonce sur un domaine qui est directement partagé entre le gouvernement fédéral et le gouvernement provincial, où le gouvernement provincial a décidé de se retirer de l'aide aux plus vulnérables. Et dans ce cas spécifique-ci, le gouvernement fédéral peut être présent pour augmenter son appui pour les gens très vulnérables ici en Ontario. Mais effectivement, on ne va pas pouvoir faire ça dans bien des domaines. C'est pour ça que c'est très important que les Canadiens fassent le bon choix cet automne pour éviter des coupures aux plus vulnérables, ce que les conservateurs font à chaque fois.
Prime Minister Kelly Lanahan from CP24, hoping to switch gears and ask you about gun violence, a major concern for many people in the city, including the mayor calling for a handgun ban. Also, your own MP, Adam Vaughan, echoing those calls for this handgun ban. What is the federal government's plan to deal with gun violence in this city, and what's your stance on handgun bans?
First of all, we recognize that this has been a deadly few weeks in the GTA. Our hearts go out to the communities, the family members affected by these tragedies. This is something that, indeed, we have taken significant steps on, but we recognize there is always more to do. I look forward to sitting down with Mayor Tory tomorrow to talk about this and other issues and how the federal government can help with the City of Toronto and indeed communities across the country as they grapple with gun violence. We have, as a government, lived up to the commitments we made in the 2015 election on strengthening gun control and bringing in measures like enhanced background checks that we know keep our communities safer. We also recognize there is more to do. Unfortunately, the Conservatives have already announced they will be reversing our strengthening of gun control measures if they get elected this fall. So that's certainly something for Canadians to keep in mind. As for what our plans are and what our next steps we're going to take if we have the opportunity of continuing to serve Canadians as a government after October 21st, we look forward to talking about that in our upcoming electoral platform, but we know there is more to do. Nous reconnaissons que ça a été plusieurs semaines tragiques pour bien des gens qui vivent dans Toronto et les environs. Nous reconnaissons les tragédies qui affectent des familles, des communautés, des innocents. Et nous allons parler demain avec le maire Tory du travail que nous pouvons faire ensemble pour garder nos communautés encore plus en sécurité. Nous reconnaissons que nous avons agi depuis 4 ans sur nos engagements qu'on a fait en 2015 pour renforcer les lois sur les contrôles d'armes à feu, pour améliorer les vérifications des antécédents avant l'achat d'armes. Mais nous reconnaissons aussi qu'il y a plus à faire. Les conservateurs, eux, ont indiqué qu'ils allaient revenir en arrière sur les mesures plus fortes qu'on a mises en place, donc c'est préoccupant. Mais nous allons avoir encore des mesures à annoncer dans notre plateforme électorale parce que nous allons continuer d'agir pour garder nos communautés en sécurité si on a l'honneur de continuer à servir en tant que gouvernement canadien à partir du 21 octobre.
Prime Minister Victoria Gibson, iPolitics. We're now 8 months into the detention of 2 Canadian men in China. We know that Minister Freeland met with her Chinese counterpart 2 weeks ago. What specifically needs to happen for that situation to end? And do you have an estimated or hoped timeline at this point for their return?
The safety and security of Canadians is always a top priority for this government, and the 2 Canadians arbitrarily detained in China remain one of the top priorities of this government. We have continued to express our displeasure and our disapproval of China's actions, and indeed have gotten strong support from the international community on this issue of arbitrary detentions. We're going to continue to put pressure and engage in constructive ways, diplomatically and otherwise, with China as we put emphasis on the fact that the situation these Canadians are facing is unacceptable. Nous allons continuer d'assurer que la protection des Canadiens est notre plus grande priorité. Nous sommes très préoccupés, évidemment, par les 2 Canadiens qui souffrent d'une détention arbitraire en Chine actuellement. Nous allons continuer de travailler très fort pour sécuriser leur libération. Nous avons encore beaucoup de travail à faire, mais nous allons continuer de le faire.
Mr. Malik here from Globe and Mail. How do you see the Chinese government's response to ongoing street protests in Hong Kong, and how is your government supporting Canadian citizens in that city?
We are extremely concerned about the situation in Hong Kong. We see the need for de-escalation of tensions. We need to see the local authorities listening to the very serious concerns brought forward by Chinese citizens in their concerns around the decisions that the local authorities and Beijing have taken. We are calling for peace, for order, for dialogue. We continue to be mindful and watchful of protecting Canadian interests and Canadians specifically in Hong Kong, but we certainly call on China to be very careful and very respectful in how it deals with people who have legitimate concerns in Hong Kong.
Do you have time for a question?
In French, please.
En français, oui. Nous sommes évidemment préoccupés par la situation à Hong Kong. Nous allons continuer d'assurer la sécurité des Canadiens dans la mesure du possible, mais en même temps, nous appelons, comme nos partenaires dans la communauté internationale, nous appelons à une déescalation, à une écoute de la part des autorités de Hong Kong et à Beijing des préoccupations que font preuve les citoyens de Hong Kong. C'est une situation qui mérite plus d'écoute et de dialogue et moins de réponses fermes et peut-être violentes. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. We appreciate your time and welcome to Parkdale Park.
Nobody will work.